When you talk about a big position, we own 1.5 million shares.
Right.
And it took us, over 3 years, 3.5 years to acquire the shares. So it's a $300 million investment. And that represents less than 1.5% of our assets. So basically, it's $300 million is a lot of money. On the other hand, it's 1.5% of our assets. But the assets that we can invest in, we have most of the investments are we have emerging markets, we have small cap, we have mid, so it doesn't fit in those pockets. But where it does fit, I have extraordinarily large positions where I can. And the reason I do is because this is, in my mind, one of the most interesting companies, maybe the most interesting that I've ever invested in. And so for my career, it's risky, but for my career, I've made 10 times, 20 times, 50 times, 30 times. We've made in a lot of companies. I think in this investment from here, in the next 15 years, we can make 30 to 50 times our money.
You said it was risky, though.
30 to 50.
You said it was risky, though. Does that mean you think of it a little bit like a lottery ticket?
No. Nothing at all like that. But you're risky because you're dependent upon a number of factors that you can't control. And so you're dependent upon, to some extent, legislatures, you're depending on some extent. So you are, with Tesla, nobody wants you to succeed except for the people who buy their product. And so the government doesn't, the car dealers don't want you to succeed because the cars don't need service. The unions don't want you to succeed because Tesla is remaking the way you make cars. So initially they have to prove the concept, then they got to prove they can make them, then they got to prove that they can make them profitably. Which
do you not worry about their cash burn? And let me ask you, related to the cash burn idea, so many people have looked at this transaction between Tesla and SolarCity, and the critique is that effectively he's using one business to support another, which is even more trouble.
So when I started to think about Tesla 4 or 5 years ago, stock was 33. We started to invest, and it's now 180, 190. Our average cost is over 200 now because I bought a lot of stock here. And when we started to invest, and I was telling people how excited I was about the company and how big they could become, people said, how can you think about that? If they get as many cars as you think they're going to get, there's 200 million cars in this country. I think they're all going to be electric someday. And there's 17 million cars a year produced in this country. I think they'll all be electric someday. But if I'm right, then what happens is that there's a tremendous demand for electricity. Where do you get it from? The electricity grid is not growing. They're not building new power plants. A new power plant costs $500 million, and they get a $50 million return on it. And you can't get the environmental permits, so they're not getting it. So now what's going to happen, and why this is such an interesting, this is not something that, okay, they're going to pay $5 billion for it, you can sell off the receivables for $2.5 billion, you pay $2 billion or $2.5 billion for it, it can make $400 or $500 million a year, steady state. That's not the reason you're buying it. That's financially, it's an interesting transaction, but that is not the reason you're buying it. The reason you're buying it is you are reinventing the electric grid. That's a bigger opportunity than cars. And you need to do it because you're not going to have enough electricity for cars. Do you know that in electric plants right now, if you think about the power that's used, do you know how electricity works? Do you ever take physics?
Years and years and years ago.
Okay, so there's a wire. And when you turn it on in the morning, you have peak power.
Right.
Peak power is because you're filling up that wire, that pipeline, with electrons. And then when you use the electrons, as you use it through the day, then you're picking up 1 or 2 electrons at a time. So initially, a surge in power, a surge in demand, then it goes down. The electric power plant, the grid, is not being used as its full capacity. You have to have more than you need by about twice. So if you can level load in some way, then you can have twice as much power produced from your existing plants as you do presently. Twice as much. So the reason this is such an interesting transaction for Tesla is they are going to be massive producers of batteries at very, very low cost. When I started, it was $22,000 a battery for a car. It's now in the low teens. It's going to be $5,000 within, I guess, 5 years. An engine cost is $10,000 going up. The battery cost is $5,000 in 5 years going down. But what you're going to do, you're going to have big batteries in people's homes and solar power. So solar power is like a Trojan horse. So solar power are these roofs, amazing roofs. Everybody
we've talked about them on the air. They look like
they look amazing.
And they're no longer just those ugly glass.
Exactly.
If anything, though, Barron is even more bullish on Musk's privately held rocket company, SpaceX. He's put several $100 million into SpaceX so far. Barron's counting on the company eventually taking off like a rocket, predicting a return on investment of up to 50 times in the next 10 years. As for Musk becoming a trillionaire, the Bloomberg Billionaires Index has him at slightly more than $200 billion. But Barron's forecasts have been pretty good so far. Ron, you are a big believer in Tesla and a big believer in SpaceX. Before everybody else went along with that route, that they were great companies, what did you see in Tesla early on, and what do you see in SpaceX now?
In Tesla early on, I thought the opportunity was to convert the cars that we make in the United States and the world from gasoline to electric. And that hadn't been accomplished ever before, and I was betting on Elon Musk. And so far, and most people bet against them. We invested $380 million in between 2014 and 2016, after thinking that we shouldn't invest in it, and was 1.5% of our assets at the time. And we made $4 billion in profit in it so far, and I think we're going to make another triple, maybe 4 times over the next 10 years.
What about SpaceX? Is SpaceX the same as Tesla?
It's the same idea where you're disrupting an industry that is a cost-plus industry. So all of the aerospace companies don't do research, and they didn't want to innovate. And the reason they didn't is because they had a business that was producing rockets, and they felt if they could use a rocket over and over again, why would they make, they wouldn't be a demand for fewer rockets. And so as a result of that, there was no innovation, and what they would do is they would subcontract out the work that they did on these rockets, so they would become more and more and more expensive, and the government would just pay it. So Elon comes along and he says, I got a cheap way to get to space, and the cheap way is by using the rockets over and over and over again, and everyone else said that was impossible to accomplish. And as a result of that, no one did it, and our man did. And this is a real big cash flowing business. He expects to have 40,000 satellites. So it's cheap satellites. Everyone else would send up satellites and be very, very expensive. When you can use the rocket over and over again, then it's inexpensive to get it. Your launch is inexpensive, and that gives you a chance to put up a lot of satellites and serve need for humanity.
All right, well, let me ask you about this. You have one person who's the CEO of both companies.
Yes.
Doesn't it make you nervous that one person is driving both companies? Normally you wouldn't invest in somebody who is running 2 companies at the same time, would you?
We have one person running 2 companies, one person who is, working, ungodly hours, totally dedicated, doesn't need very much sleep. I was speaking to a director of SpaceX 2 nights ago. And so I was saying, how's Elon doing? And he says, he's doing unbelievably. He lives in this small cottage, 2 bedrooms, on this desert property, And I said, is there air conditioning? He said, yes, there's air conditioning, but he's from South Africa, so he doesn't need as much, but it is air conditioning. And he works all but 5 hours a day, and he works continuously, totally dead. He's like you. So you spend your time on airplanes, he spends his time in factories and producing these things.
Do you have a Tesla?
Yes, 4 of them.
And when you drive them and you say maybe something could be better, do you call up Elon and say, can you fix this?
Actually, we do. And when we bought the first one, my wife was complaining about the makeup mirror, and she says, there's no makeup mirror here. I said, how can there not be a makeup mirror? So I call him up and I say, we had just been to visit their engineering plant where the guy who comes up with the design for the cars. And I said, well, my wife is complaining about this car that there's no makeup mirror. He says, yeah, we've had to do a special, where they put in that actual mirror. So that was my wife's idea.
They don't call it the Barron makeup?
No.
Right now, many people think the stock market's pretty high, fairly valued, very fully valued, many people would say. So are you nervous about that?
I don't worry about it. And in 2019, December 99 through 2008, were really difficult 8 or 9 years for the stock market. The stock market was down 30 or 40%, 3 or 4% a year for 8 or 9 years. We didn't make a lot of money in that period of time, but we didn't lose. We were up 25% over that 8 or 9 year period of time, which was really terrible for the market. And then since then, of course, we've done very well. And what I think is that, so my big picture of the world, the only thing I am certain of is, I'm sure about our economy, I'm sure about our country, but I think that the value of my money will fall in half every 17 or 18 years. That means that everything I want to buy is going to double in price every 17 or 18 years. So I regard stocks as a hedge against that depreciation of my currency. So I want to own stocks, shares the businesses that can outpace inflation. So that's my simple look.